Hello, David McMillan here, former smuggler and I guess troublemaker with smuggling operations in 5 continents for over 40 years. Arrested many times, on death row twice, escaped from prison when the need arose. And tonight, well, I guess you're probably wondering why I look like a combination of priest and, ambulance-chasing lawyer. Well, there is a reason. Because I'm going to be the devil's advocate. And there's a good reason for that. Why? Because the devil's advocate has more fun and does something much more interesting. Last week saw the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Robert Maxwell, a millionaire and, a newspaper man. Well, media magnate, as they like to say. She was friends for many years with Jeffrey Epstein, a man charged with sex offences of a particular kind, young girls, a kind of entrapment, seduction, money, influence. And he ended up dead in his prison cell. Now, many of you think his death was very suspicious. He had names, people were worried that he was going to spill the beans, so his death was necessary. Well, I don't know, I've seen a lot of people in my unfortunate, must be close to 20 years behind bars, who've killed themselves. Often the ones you never expected, the ones who seemed, to be coping, to be quite chirpy. And suddenly you'd hear, John has killed himself, or Freddie was found swinging in a cramped position in his cell. And you'd be surprised because they seemed unlikely. Was Jeffrey Epstein unlikely? Perhaps so. People think that if you've got access to millions, you're always going to be happy. But he was denied bail on his charges. And he should have seen that coming. He also should have cleaned up his house because there was apart from more incriminating evidence, which would have been used in a broad conspiracy case, there was a passport. It was a novelty passport. Was it Saudi? Well, it was some silliness. In any event, that was used to demonstrate that he was a flight risk. But in fact, the real reason he was denied bail was because they didn't want him and his money being able to be used to influence the outcome. And they were convinced that he'd done that before, and it certainly looked that way. But am I playing devil's advocate representing Jeffrey? No, we don't know anything about him. The fact that he's dead, and despite, I've seen probably 5 major documentaries on the Epstein case, and interviews with policemen, his victims looking back after many, many years at their teenage life. But none of them really said anything much about him. I came out of them knowing nothing more than Epstein because they were concentrating on the prosecution case. Now, had he had a trial and a defense advocate, the priestly devil's advocate, perhaps we might learn more. And perhaps, if Ghislaine Maxwell survives to trial, we might learn something of not only Jeffrey's character, but hers, and the rather peculiar relationship between the two of them. Now, of course, if we go into anybody's sex life, it's bound to be a little bit peculiar. Nature cooked up the whole idea to ward off certain illnesses, a mating of 2 opposites, or not necessarily opposites, but mixed genes. It's good for survival. But along with that meant a kind of nature's coerced behavior into something that might seem in many ways irrational: lust, desire, sex itself. So what goes on in the mind behind all of that is to some extent always a mystery, and often alarmingly surprising. But here you might be asking, why would I want to even play at being the devil's advocate for people like Ghislaine? Well, there's a kind of a reason. When people look back on wars and conquests and hard times and injustices, they look back on it because they're the survivors, mostly, of the winning side. And the winning side is on justice. So when we look back at World War II, do we relive the battles of our brothers in arms, our own forces, American, British, Commonwealth, if I can cover the range from Canada to Australia, and all the other much closer players, the Russians on the front line, the Ukrainians who were pushed into being on the Russian side since the revolution, and then forced onto being the German side if they were to survive at all, and then pushed around again. My God, who knows how they look back on it. But in any event, we are less likely to spend time thinking about the winners, our side, than the losers. Why? Because we ask ourselves, could they have won? And many of us become armchair generals, wondering how the Germans could have got out of the strap they were in. Could they have fought their way out of Stalingrad? Would their wonder weapons have done any good? What was the makeup of their bungling? Was Hitler as truly incompetent a general? He was certainly no Napoleon. And his underlings, Goebbels, certainly a master propagandist, but nothing to do with fighting. And yet the German army's generals were mostly pretty good. But then again, fighting losing battles once everything was declared war. Many, many mistakes. And I won't digress on those, but I only point out that it is a great tendency to take on the losing side. We put ourselves in General Lee's position in the Great War of the South, wondering if he could have somehow saved particular battles, or somehow even more miraculously mounted campaigns that could have possibly defeated the North. We do that a lot, and we're sentimental about the losers to an extent. Of course, we're never sentimental about the Nazis or the regime, but we're still interested. Are we sentimental about the southern states? I guess in a way we are, even though they were protecting something that was going to fail. Slavery never worked for many people. It didn't really work for the Romans. It prevented them from having, they didn't get an industrial revolution because there was no need. Labor was too cheap. So by 1860s, to maintain slavery, just on a practical level, it would have never have kept up. So they were going to lose. But still, we often fight the battles of the losing side. And yet, should we become the armchair advocates of the villains of today? I've been in quite a few court trials, and of course I'm on the defense, so I suppose you could say my lawyers have always been devil's advocate for David McMillan. And sometimes I made their job easier, and often quite hard, going into trials where there were 30 false passports, lots of talk, state's witnesses. That didn't make it easier. But still, I kept a jury out a week, and they acquitted me of 11 of 12 counts. Not that that really made any difference against the master state that put me away anyway for over a decade. But I've been in that position. So perhaps I have a greater weakness for being the defense lawyer for the indefensible. When Libya's Muamar Qaddafi was thrown from power, I was a bit puzzled. I thought he had, he had an iron grip, sure. Most people in that region usually do. But I thought he had a defence. He had a great, what was it, the man-made river scheme, using the aquifers under the desert to pump water around a dry land. People lived, well, providing they obeyed his rule, they lived pretty well. There certainly wasn't the chaos that followed when the West backed various rebel forces and supposedly democratic governments that were going to come in, and still never have, of course. And there's been more death and carnage since we interfered than having left it alone. That's often the trouble with the modern West. We don't finish it. I suppose you could say, if you were trying to defend some form of colonialism, well, the wars can be briefer, and there are some benefits to the losing side, even though they're always regarded as second-class. Well, they're not really citizens even, but they're always regarded as second-class. But they get into a position with better railways and some education where they can throw off those shackles. So perhaps that's part of a process, and one which would take probably longer and more bitter otherwise. Having said that, we can very readily criticize the British Empire for using the normal strategy when getting out of India. That is, rather than leave the unified Indian states altogether, they acceded to the Anglophile Pakistan leader, Jinnah, into having a separate Islamic homeland. Well, you know the result of that. Millions died, and in fact India and Pakistan are regularly at war with each other. And the point I'm getting at is that was in the British interest, because divide and conquer. Do not leave, if you have to leave, anything too powerful. So, in the guise of being fair, you break everything up and start enmities between people. So there's the downside of getting out. And getting out has become peculiar at the moment because the poor Hong Kongers were guaranteed 50 years of their old system, and the mainland Chinese are not having any of it. They're a bit nervous. I think, again, they're trying to defend something whose time has come to an end. They're making trouble for themselves where they need have had none. If they'd waited out the 50 years, well, who knows what somebody's going to be like in another, what's it been? It'll be another 30-odd years. Another generation will have passed. I think they'll find they'd been arguing about nothing to no good avail. It's rather hard to imagine the Chinese government running the same way in another 30 years, and including in Hong Kong. So why make a fuss now? But back to our devils, the ones I should be advocate for. Qaddafi, no saving him, though he was a snappy dresser. Had an Italian clothes designer. Made those robes look pretty snappy, I must say. And, just as well, he wasn't in his tent, a luxurious tent, when the Americans bombed him. I think they got some poor girl. Well, those things happen, I guess, when you're pointlessly trying to do something other than kill somebody. It's always a hit-and-miss affair, isn't it, when you do it remotely? I've found you have to be up close, staring them in the eye. At least you know you've got the right person. And you might decide, once you're that close, not to kill them after all. So let's move on to somebody else. Who can we defend? As the Gulf War back in Iraq was the first Gulf War, I'll say. That was when George Bush Sr. was Prez. Well, the writing was on the wall for that one, and everybody could see it coming. And I looked at old Saddam Hussein and thought, you really need a decent manager. Somebody who could not just be political advisor. I think he had that one nailed down, to use a phrase, but somebody who could make his mischief look a bit better. Steaming into Kuwait that way. It didn't look good. It would never look good. And because the Saudis wanted to defend it, and everybody wants to be the pal of the Saudis, we in the West had to go along as well. But there was a defence. Had I been his advocate, I wouldn't have even allowed just an invasion. Oh, no. I would have said, Saddam, let's put some money into the Freedom for Kuwaitis Fund. What? Yes, did you know, well, there will be once we organise them, a little bunch of student, they look good, Democrats who want to throw off the Kuwaiti royalty and have democratic elections. Now, nobody could criticise us for putting money into that. Sadders? Yes? Good one? What's the point, he'd say. Well, I'll tell you, you just do it. So about a year later, we've got Kuwaitis for democracy, being arrested, thrown in jail, tortured, the usual things the Kuwaitis would have done, and generally assassinated if they got too good at their job. And then we would have pointed to something else. Saddam, I would say, I think we can make something of this. What's that? Well, as you know, the Kuwaitis have been slant drilling under the border. Yes, that's true, viewers. The Kuwaitis at the time were not only soaking the great sponge of oil under their own country, but sending their little probing drills right under Iraqi territory and sucking out some of their black gold. It's kind of a border violation if I ever saw one. So we have that. Yes, they're the first breakers of international standards. Something should be made of that, Saddam. I think so. And then, when the student uprising comes, funded, well, of course, indirectly, but funded by the freedom-loving Iraqi people, well, who can complain? Yes? Let them in. You'd have to send in some assassins and do a pretty damn thorough job of the Kuwaiti royalty and strike deals in the back rooms with the West, of course. But that was the thing Saddam was not very good at. He wasn't a bit of a card sharp. He was sharp, all right, but mostly with a cutlass and other tools you don't want to know about. Gee, look what his kids did to that football team. Grisly. Kick a goal there. Anyway, no, Saddam was something of the hillbilly in a kind of Iraqi way. And, gassing the Kurds, not good publicity, and unnecessary. They couldn't win anything anyway. The Kurds have wanted their own state for a long time, and will they get it? Do they deserve it? Sure they do. Kurdish-speaking areas, so on and so forth. But the fly in the ointment there is Turkey, which has a large Kurdish population, and not going to hear of any of that. We pay lip service to independence movements, but when they're a bit close to home or we have vested interest, no can do. Look at the Basques in Spain. The Spanish government won't let them become an independent European nation. It just won't happen. They have their own language, though, which should mean something. Or should it? Or should any of it? These lines on a piece of paper mean anything? Can't we have our linguistic differences and live more or less in happy hatred? So, Saddam would have needed a decent advisor and advocate. And you could see so many bits of bungling public relations he did. You remember when he held those, he called them guests, but they were really Western hostages. And there were televised things that were supposed to be showing them treated well. They were all trembling in fear, including what looked to be about an 11-year-old boy who was allowed to approach his greatness. And he said to the young man, the Iraqi boys who are watching this will be so envious that you're allowed to talk to me. God, wouldn't they like to be in your shoes? Gulp, said the little kid with some dignity for a gulp. he'd probably picked up on the adult conversations about what can happen when things go badly for hostages. No, that would be a moment that I would advise old Sadders not to do. So by the time he was unearthed by a big beefy marine hiding under a piece of concrete with a ragged beard, saying, what was it? Something about I want diplomatic immunity or talk terms for negotiated truce. I don't know. It was gibberish. It was too late. The next minute he's having his mouth swabbed. And a couple of years later his neck popped off under the new justice. Yes. He certainly needed an advocate. Unfortunately, he barely even got the priest. So, where am I going with all of this nonsense? What I'm really saying is wanting to know about the villains is a bit more interesting. Especially when you want to do a lot of what-ifs and relive some history, which is a way of looking back at your own, isn't it? Wondering if we could have got to the good place by a better route. I suppose unfortunate Ghislaine Maxwell will go to trial, but I fear we won't learn much. I think there'll be a plea deal of some kind, or some kind of a bargain. Oh yes, the victims will have their televised moments. Some of them seem rather fragile, and certainly fragile when... Well, I don't want to make little of what they went through, but if I was her lawyer, I could question that being massaged by a pervert left lifelong psychological scars. I think they'd have to be balanced upon the fresh scars of making yourself appear a victim. Yeah, I'm all for getting over things myself. Of course, it's tangled with a lot of civil suits, so we can't unpick those threads. But will we learn anything about Ghislaine and, well, what kind of relationship we had with the rather peculiar Jeffrey Epstein? You know, he always struck me as a bit of well, you'd think he sounded like something of an introvert, but he was apparently very good at convincing people that he was their man. A couple of businessmen were certainly convinced that he was the guy for them. But this is very hard to tell because they're talking after he's already blackened and in some cases already dead. They're not likely to say that, well, with me, he treated me fairly. He did well for me, I profited. He seemed a kind of interesting guy to talk to. But we don't have a word. The British Royal Andrew is not going to say anything, and probably better that he doesn't, because his public speaking has not gone well for him, and I don't think he would have been the most intuitive person. And to ask him about Jeffrey Epstein's character or motivations, what drove him? Oh, I don't mean all the tacky perversion. You know, as perverts go, he wasn't a very interesting one. How provincial and lame is it to go to all of that trouble to lure bored small-town girls into, what was it, some kind of orgiastic sex? No, for the most cases it was just, they were wanking him off. I mean, in many ways he was sort of pathetic. But I'll say this, and I won't go into the evidence for it, but a lot of prison and some great weirdos I've met, there does seem to be a link between deformed sexual organs and perversion and hostility and the desire to conquer in a sexual way. I'll leave that for some other video channel, but it's something you might not want to dwell about. Not too much. So, in an era when people, even our villains, are painted in a very cardboard fashion, from the villains of the past history, the slavers, the colonists, the empire builders. They get a bit vague about painting who's the villain in wartime, but we'll just generally go with anybody who wasn't on our side, shall we? That makes it simple. But most of the pictures of the villains are very simple. We don't know much about it. We're certainly, when they're criticised and their statues are pulled down and all memory of them should be erased, they become non-persons in some Orwellian novel. Yes, when history's rewritten and they don't exist anymore, we still know even less of very little. We know at all. Really, we want to become time travellers and go back to see how things were then. But the time is being erased. And I guess we just don't want to know. But I'm telling you, you'd find it a hell of a lot more interesting. So when you see the mob turn against somebody next time, for whatever it is, and whatever next wave of villainy is exposed and that person hounded, their memory destroyed, think as I did when I visited a small village in, well, what was I, probably 19, on the borders of Afghanistan. I offended those people. Yeah, I certainly did. I went in there with my little troop. I was on a mission, of course, to buy some hashish, and I spoke with the elders and we came to terms. But on my way out, I was served tea by, I guess, a young girl in a full burqa. When I say full, I mean it had a grill over the face. You could barely see if she had eyes. Could she see what she was doing? Well, she didn't spill the tea, so I guess she was all right. And being, a 20-year-old half-wit, I made a wisecrack that they would have understood that, well, maybe, okay, looks like the dress is too hot for this sort of weather, but at least you can marry off the ugly ones, huh? Villagers, yes? No, it didn't go down well. So, as my guards and escorts clutched their weapons rather tightly and we backed out of that little village, apparently the cup that I drank from was smashed. Yes, the chair that I sat in was burnt. Oof, that had to go. And even the history of my footsteps was swept away by some other woman in a burqa with a bunch of sticks acting as a broom, sweeping away my footprints in the sand. Yes, the history of my presence there was eradicated. Well, it would have been had they not sold me the hash later on and taken my money and allowed a couple of wells to be dug and a few jobs for the sons who were to be their new royalty. No, they have their alternate history and I have mine. But then again, I would. I'm the devil's advocate. Good night.